my pumpkin chocolate bundt cake. To top it all off, I finish it with a butterscotch glaze. So let me get right to it. Now this makes a big cake recipe. So I start with 2 3/4 cups of all-purpose flour. And 3/4 cup of granulated sugar. I need 2½ teaspoons of baking powder, as well as a teaspoon of baking soda. Now this bundt cake is a swirl of pumpkin and chocolate cakes together. I do like the spice element. It matches the pumpkin well. And I'm going with a combination of a teaspoon of cinnamon and a teaspoon of ground ginger. Lastly, ½ teaspoon of salt. And I'll sift this all together. Now in a separate bowl, I want to combine my wet ingredients. So I have 2 cups of pure pumpkin puree. Now this can be pumpkin that you buy, roast, and puree yourself, or you can buy it already tinned. Just make sure you're buying the unsweetened and unspiced version. I add 3/4 cup of buttermilk to the pumpkin. This really makes this cake nice and moist. I will add 2 eggs, and I do need a little bit of vegetable oil, 1/4 cup. And while I added my granulated sugar to my dry ingredients, my moist brown sugar, a cup's worth, I add to my wet ingredients. And I find by doing this, it dissolves into the wet mixture, and it really makes the cake easy to blend. So that way you don't need electric beaters or a stand mixer for a cake this fancy. There we go. Now I can add this all at once to my flour mixture, and I'll give this a stir to blend it. As you can see, this cake makes a lot of batter. It's ready for a bundt pan. And you know what? You can even stop right here and bake just a regular pumpkin loaf cake. Even stir in some fresh cranberries, wouldn't that be delicious? But I'm going for the wow factor, and I want to divide this in half and make half of this cake chocolate. I've got a separate bowl, and you don't have to precisely measure, but just loosely gauge half of the pumpkin batter. So this is going to be my regular pumpkin batter, and to this bowl, I'm going to sift in ½ cup of cocoa powder. That's all it takes to add perfect amount of intense chocolate flavor, because cocoa powder just is cocoa, no added sugar or other ingredients. Now, because I am adding ½ cup more of dry ingredients to this batter, I need to balance out the liquid a little bit. So I add an additional 1/4 cup of buttermilk. The last thing to add, 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder. That way, both the pumpkin batter and the chocolate batter will have the same consistency. So this chocolate batter has that pumpkin flavor. And don't forget, it has the spices in there too, the cinnamon and ginger. And that combination of chocolate and pumpkin together, oh, it is divine. Okay, now I'm ready to go. Here is my bundt pan with the hole in the middle. The pan's well greased. Now, to fill my pans, what I like to do is dollop, alternating pumpkin and then chocolate. So I've got 1 full layer of alternating pumpkin and chocolate. And then for the top layer, I do the same thing and I place the pumpkin on top of the chocolate layer beneath it, kind of making a pumpkin chocolate checkerboard. Go. And the final step is the swirling. And I find because of the density of the cake and the depth of the pan, I like to use a spatula or even a paring knife. And I pull it right through the bottom of the cake. Don't be afraid to swirl. I'll give the pan a little tap to level out the batter a little bit, and now this is ready for the oven. So typical to loaf cakes, it takes a while, 60 to 75 minutes in a 350 oven. Now, to check the doneness, I'll insert a skewer in the center of the cake. It comes out clean, so I know it's done. Now, your variation in timing from 60 to 75 minutes really can depend on the consistency of your pumpkin puree. That's why there's such a time range. I'll let that cool for a bit, then I'll turn it out of the pan to cool completely. And you know what's in store, the butterscotch glaze, the finishing touch for a perfect bundt cake. A bundt cake is a loaf cake that obviously feeds a crowd. And to dress mine up, I'm adding a butterscotch glaze. And not just a regular butterscotch glaze, but a brown butter butterscotch glaze. I'll turn this on high heat, and essentially what I'm doing is caramelizing the natural sugars that are in the butter. And this intensifies the flavor and kind of adds a caramel note, but also a hint of nuttiness. I love using brown butter when I'm glazing things, especially pumpkin desserts. There you go. I take it off the heat, and you want to strain out those solids. Now, this butterscotch glaze is a hot glaze, so while my butter is still warm, I can add my 1/3 cup of dark brown sugar, along with 2 tablespoons of milk. And I'll bring this back up to a simmer on medium heat while giving it a little stir. The milk here helps the brown sugar dissolve into the butter. And there we go. So I can take it right off the heat and pour it over my bowl, which has a cup of sifted icing sugar in it. So this cools down the butter and sugar mixture, and it melts the icing sugar at the same time, so it's nice and smooth. Now I'll add my vanilla. And it really depends on how hot and cool your ingredients are if you need to adjust the consistency. My glaze seems a little thick right now, so I'm going to add just a touch more milk, a few drops at a time. And there we go. When I use this butterscotch glaze, I try and pour it in an even drizzle in one round. You don't want to fuss with it too much. And then it sets with this gorgeous shine. Let a little drip over the sides, into the middle. But you can see how quickly it does start to set. Oh, I absolutely adore that. Once you do give it a bit of time to set, then it is ready to serve. And I love how this glaze sets with a satin finish. And it's a great make-ahead dessert. That is part of the ease of making loaf cakes. Another great thing about loaf cakes, including this bundt cake, is that they freeze really well. So you can even make them further ahead. There we go. Look at that great pumpkin and chocolate swirl. And then you've got that satiny glaze.